Good morning, friends. Thanks for joining me for another of our Unfolding the Words. Today is Sunday and an opportunity to gather with your brothers and sisters to worship the Lord. I hope that's possible for you today. We've been studying in the book of Genesis, working our way through that segment from chapters 3 to 11 that introduce to us the real dynamics that explain the world in which we find ourselves and even explain our own hearts. Today, I want to begin the 6th chapter, and I'm going to begin reading in verse 1. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. And the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore 2 children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Quick review. In chapter 5, we were looking at the 10 generations from Adam to Noah. Generations marked by increasing degeneration, societies impacted by sin and sin choice of mankind. Seth, we saw, replaced Abel as the one through whom the godly line would run, through whom the promise of the coming Messiah would be found. We also discovered that at every one of those generations, most of the people were choosing to follow Cain and Cain's way, rejecting Abel's example and the teaching of Adam and Eve on how to come to God and how to deal with sin. Most followed the error. But a few people followed the truth, came to God God's way. And then as we turned to Seth, which was the 2nd generation out, we saw that his son Enosh, in his life period, there was a marked movement of people who began to call on the name of the Lord. Not that many, not pervasive throughout the society, but nonetheless they existed. Then we looked at the end of that line, looked at Enoch, and of course, finally looked at the birth of Noah. How at his point in time, no one was left who was choosing to follow after the Lord. Now today, chapter 6 opens up and sets the stage for this culminating activity of judgment from God on this 10 generations of mankind. And it sets the stage for it by talking about a problem of unequal yoking. We introduced the 6th chapter with a discussion about how marriage was taking place between the daughters of man and the sons of God. At least that's the terminology being employed here. Now, this particular part of Genesis has given rise to a lot of speculation and things that people have argued one way or the other about. Perhaps the most dominant of the speculations have been the speculation that what's being talked about here is some sort of intermarriage between angels and fallen angels, perhaps, and humanity. But that particular speculation, and I do call it that because that's not what it says here, that speculation is problematic for several reasons. Number one, Genesis to this point, and then continuing through the book of Genesis, has been focused on contrasting the picture of how humanity developed in the sense of following the way of Cain over against how humanity developed following the way of Adam and Eve and Abel. It's the contrasting picture of the lines of human response to God, not the contrasting picture of angelic response and human response. Secondly, it's a problem to assume and speculate this is talking about angels and cohabiting with mankind, because the Bible clearly tells us that angels are spirit beings. Now, when it serves God's purpose, they can take on a human form, but they aren't humans. And certainly in Luke chapter 20 in the Gospels, Jesus, in answering a question that was posed to him, said, listen, in the future, once people die, they will be like the angels, meaning no marriage. He was answering a question related to a woman whose husband had died and she married another. Listen, in the future, there is no marriage. Thus, again, kind of calling into question this idea of physical relations existing between an angelic order and humanity. But perhaps even the strongest struggle with that other kind of an answer is this, that The book of Genesis was given to us to explain God's judgment on sin within humanity. Its focus is on the wickedness of human beings and their determination and rebellion and pride to refuse to come to God, God's way, to deal with their sin appropriately. We find in the scriptures some discussion of angels and fallen angels, those that followed Satan in his rebellion, but that's not the focus in this portion of the Word of God. So while we do learn something else about that, this portion is preeminently focused on sinful mankind and the interrelationships between those that chose to follow God and those that didn't. Certainly the interrelationship between Cain and Abel, and Cain killing Abel because of his frustrations over God's acceptance of Abel. Well, for those reasons, I think it is speculative and perhaps not best for us to assume there was some sort of intermarriage going on between angelic beings and human beings. Better, in fitting the context of the passage, what we're studying is an intermarriage that was going on between those who called on the name of the Lord and those who didn't call on the name of the Lord. Because again, those are the two great categories that we encounter in this passage, in the verses leading up to it, and certainly the verses afterward. I believe he's talking about the interweaving of the line of Cain, those following Cain, not even necessarily in his genetic line, but those who followed his way, and those who followed Abel and later Seth in their decision. At least the faithful ones in those lines, because many weren't faithful. What was happening is that as humanity expanded, as the world began to grow, more and more people were being born, those who were born in families that sought after the Lord began naturally to be interacting with people who were born in families that didn't. And as they began to interact together, affections and connections began to emerge. And at some point, those who were choosing to follow the Lord, to call upon the name of the Lord, decided that their attraction to those who weren't was strong enough that they would intermarry together. One of the things that comes out of such a decision, inevitably, is that those who do not call upon the name of the Lord pull people who are calling upon the name of the Lord away from the sincerity and fullness of that commitment. Almost always it works that way. Now, once in a while, there's an anecdotal evidence of somebody who was brought to Christ that way, but that certainly stands against the normal pattern. And in my life, I'm 71 years old. I've been a Christian since I was 18. I've just seen a very small number in which, in an unequally yoked relationship, those that were calling on the name of the Lord managed to somehow draw the partner to do the same thing. Rather, they were pulled off into complacency and half-heartedness in the faith by the unbelieving partner. And I think this is why, starting here in Genesis 6, and then spread throughout the Old Testament, and certainly into the New Testament, we see a continuing warning against unequal yoking for the people of God. God makes it absolutely plain that there's danger in this for the people of God, and he sets the stage for it right here. I was thinking in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, how he places it there. Let me read it to you, beginning in verse 14. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what possible partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. This picture in 2 Corinthians is repeated again in the New Testament and repeated frequently in the Old Testament. God is saying, listen, I do not want an intermarrying going on between those that call upon my name and those that don't, because it squelches the vitality of the faith of those who call on my name, and in some way is compromising the ability to reach those who don't know Christ and draw them to Christ. So here at the very beginning, and tomorrow, Lord willing, we'll look at more of the details of the consequences that emerged out of this unequal yoking. So at least we begin to see the problem of unequal yoking. And I don't think we've encountered it here until this generation preceding the flood, because there was hardly anybody in those preceding generations that did in fact seek the Lord. A few, but it was by the 10th generation that there were enough who were seeking the Lord, and who then in turn began, or eighth and ninth and 10th generations, who then in turn intermarried with those who weren't, and we began to see this problem emerge. Much like the principle that we didn't see polygamy establish itself until a couple generations out from Cain. Well, think about these things. I look forward to sharing with you more tomorrow as we look at some of the consequences of the intermarriage that was going on in that period of time preceding the flood. God bless.